Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our very first Hawaii Economic Association online webinar. My name is Lesley Gabrielle Harvey of the Hawaii Business Consultancy and Board President of the Hawaii Economic Association. Thank you for joining us today. I see a lot of familiar names in our attendee list and many new names. We had an overwhelmingly positive response to this event. Welcome to those returning and those joining us for the first time. A special thank you to those who donated to our student fund. We subsidize student attendance to our events, and this will go a long way in ensuring our events remain accessible to the next generation of bright minds. Like all of you, we are still adapting to this new climate personally and professionally. This is the first time an HEA event has been held online. We welcome your feedback in letting us know how we did through a short feedback form that we'll share at the end. If you registered, you'll receive the link by email. You'll also receive the slides and a recording of the event. If you haven't yet registered, please do so at heamay2020.eventbrite.com. In any event, we're glad to be back delivering economic education, information, and resources. This month's topic couldn't be more timely given some progress on the horizon in opening back up our local economy. In June, we're planning a follow-on event featuring Alan Oshima, who was appointed by Governor Ige to lead the statewide COVID-19 recovery initiative. He will discuss Hawaii's plans and progress toward economic recovery. At this point, we anticipate that this event will also be a webinar. Updates will be emailed. Today's event is about an hour of panelist presentations followed by 30 minutes of Q&A to wrap up by 1 p.m. Each panelist will present for about 10 minutes, and attendees will have their questions answered during the Q&A portion after the panel presentations. Please write your questions at any time using the chat function. The button to open the chat window can be found at the bottom of your screen. If you know to whom your question is addressed, please indicate the panelist's name at the start of your question. Because we have so many joining us, as I mentioned early on, we're going to keep all the other mics muted. This should ensure that you're able to hear and see our panel clearly for the duration. If you're not able to hear or see, or you have other technical difficulties, please send a private chat to Sierra. Find Sierra Brewer there on the list. She has the HEA logo by her name. She may be able to help troubleshoot, but either way, please bear with us today if we do encounter any technical difficulties. We have a lot of people on. Now, briefly before we begin, a look back as COVID-19 developed. First, late last year, a number of pneumonia cases from unknown causes were confirmed in China. The first case recorded in Hawaii was on March 6th. School closures were then announced just a week later on March 15th. The following day came federal warnings against gatherings of more than 10 people and warnings against discretionary travel. Soon after, Governor Ige instituted a 14-day quarantine for all visitors to Hawaii. Then on the 23rd of March, Hawaii's stay-at-home order, took effect. Shortly thereafter, stimulus packages were rolled out. And finally, April 25th, Hawaii's stay-at-home order was extended through the end of May. Now, with that brief look back, I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists to begin with Eugene Tian, Chief Economist at the Hawaii State Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, also former HEA president. Dr. Tian spends a great deal of time thinking, writing, and worrying about Hawaii's economy. He oversees DBED research on economic issues, including tourism, emerging industries, diversification, technology, energy, and taxation. His team also produces the official statewide short-range economic forecast quarterly and the long-range population and economic forecast every 5 years. Eugene?
Okay, let me start my slideshow. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your
okay.
screen.
I will start with a pie chart here. So this is the pie chart we always show the rating analyst when we do state bond sales. So basically this shows our economic diversification or economic structure. So you can see that this is 2019 jobs. This is mainly the payroll jobs, the jobs coming from the Labor Department. The only number I added is the federal military number is about 55,000 on the payroll. So you can see on the chart on the right-hand side is the tourism-intensive jobs. So that is about 37%. And on the left-hand side is 63% is local intensive jobs. So remember this trade, transportation, utilities, leisure, hospitality, they have a lot of local component as well. For example, the utilities is mainly local, serving the local. The leisure, hospitality, there is a food services, is, majority of them, over 50% is serving the local people. But how do we separate tourism? Because tourism is not a industry by North American industry classification system. So we do that with our input-out model. This is a DBED input-out model for 2012. We are working on the 2017 version of the model because every 5 years, the US Census Bureau does a survey called Census of Economics. So that number, the 2017 just became available. We are working on that. But this model is more complex than this. We have two versions. One is a 20 industry model like this, and we also have a 68 industry model. So this is only partial of it, but the model shows all the connections, all the interrelationship between the industries. So which industry purchase from which industry, and household, visitors, government, which industry they are purchasing from. If you look at the column called the direct sales to visitors, this is in 2012, is about $16 billion. That's including the visitors spending out of pocket, also including the airlines and cruise line spending is estimated about $2 billion. So the total sales in the whole state is about $150 billion. If you look at it, the direct impact is about 11%. But when we include the indirect is about 16.1%, because between 2012 and 2017, the visitor industry grew substantially. So the impact now, direct indirect, is about 17%. And this slide shows the jobs. The previous slide shows in terms of dollar value, which is the sales. In terms of direct and indirect jobs, the tourism industry contribute about 19.3%. I think now it's over, is about 20%. That's for direct jobs is about 14%. Interesting thing you can see, I circled that. You look at the construction, there is no direct purchase from visitors in the construction industry. There is also no purchase from utilities like water or utilities. And finance is zero. But because those industries, they support the hotel, retail, restaurant, and in terms of indirect, they actually contribute, for example, the utility contribute about 15% to the tourism industry. Finance, insurance, about 6%. Going forward, these slides, I'm trying to, because this COVID-19, it is the first time, it is very serious. We don't know what model to use for the future economic forecast. So I'm looking at the purpose of this to look at the 2009 recession, what happened to our economy. This is the number of businesses we call establishment. So during the 2009 and 2011, actually there are 2 years lag. We lost nearly 2,000 businesses establishment. The three industries hit the most, the hardest, is finance, insurance, construction, and the retail trade. If you look at 10 years after, between 2007 and 2017, we actually still losing businesses. So the in terms of businesses, it's never recovered. The business about 99.7% is small businesses. I'm sorry. You look at the number previous slide, it shows about 1916, and this is small business is about 1913. So it's 99.7%. Now looking at the businesses, we have two types of businesses. One is they just close. They are not operating, they just out of business. And the next group is the businesses that are in construction. They are not doing business at the regular scale, or they are doing, they are just stop operating temporarily. So the ones business lost from the business construction is the biggest. So the net loss is about 3,500. So you can see the construction is nearly 10,000. So this is in terms of establishment. What about the jobs? When you look at this slide, the jobs loss from the business construction is actually the largest. It's nearly over 57,000 jobs lost from the construction. So we have some expansion, about 30. So the net loss is during the 2008-2009, that 1 year period, we lost about 27,000 jobs just from business construction. And this shows that the visitors' arrival in the last business cycle, 2 business cycles, it took 5 years from 911 and also 5 years from the Great Recession in 2009. So this is in terms of visitor arrivals. What about in terms of the GDP, the economic contribution? So we group the industries into tourism intensive. The ones I show on the pie chart, hospitality and also trade, it took about 6 years to recover. So that visitor intensive industry, it contribute about 26% of the real GDP. It took 6 years. And if you look at the non-tourism intensive sectors, it took 2 years. Why I'm showing this is because without any base for the future projection, I'm thinking for our projection, we will follow this model, which means for a non-tourism sector, we'll recover in 2 years. For tourism, we'll recover in about 5 to 6 years. So it is a long-term. I think we have to be a little patient. And this slide shows all the federal money coming to the state. I compile a big list. So if people are interested, we can provide you the list. So adding all the money together is about $7 billion to the state. So I assume most of the money will be spent in the year 2020. During the 2009 recession, the state received about $1.8 billion from the federal, but it took about 5 years to spend the $1.8 billion. Even in 2013, the last year, we still have 5% and didn't spend. But most of the money this time is for either for unemployment insurance or from a paycheck help, all these. So if I would do the economic forecast today, I will do like this. So the 2019, the total GDP, this is in terms of real nominal GDP without inflation adjusted, is about $97 billion. So I will see the household will decrease a little bit, 4.2%. The main reason is most of the federal money coming, although from the federal government, but it will be reflected in the household spending. So it will decrease by about 4%. Then the private investment will decrease by about 13, and the federal will have some decrease. This is not including the federal assistance programs, is just federal spending based on the civilians, military spending. The state will have about $1 billion shortfall, so will decrease by 1 billion. And the visitor, I assume this is a pure assumption, will recover by about 40% in the last 2 quarters. Will recover by 40%. We already have a 2.1 million already for the first quarter. So there will be another 2.5 million visitors coming for the third quarter and the fourth quarter. So the total, if I would do the economic projection, will decrease by between around 13%, the economy. So this is the largest decrease. I think that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Eugene.
And I understand here, I see these messages now that for many people, you couldn't hear me in the beginning. So I want to just reiterate a couple of things before we move on. My name is Lesley Gabrielle Harvey of the Hawaii Business Consultancy and board president of the Hawaii Economic Association. I want to thank everybody who's joined us today. We had an overwhelmingly positive response to this event, both returning attendees and those joining us for the first time. Extra special thank you to those who donated to our student fund. We use that funding to subsidize student participation at our events, and this will go a long way in ensuring our events remain accessible to the next generation of bright minds. I do want to mention that we are doing this for the very first time, this online format, so I appreciate you bearing with us through any technical difficulties. We do welcome your feedback in letting us know how we did, and we'll have a short feedback form to share with you at the end. If you registered, you'll also get this link by email. Additionally, you'll receive the slides and a recording of the event. That notification will go through the Eventbrite registration. So if somehow you found yourself here, but you haven't yet registered and you'd like that information, please be sure to register at heamay2020.eventbrite.com. So with that being said, thank you very much, Eugene, for that overview. And we are going to next hear from Seth Colby, who is the Tax Research and Planning Officer of the Hawaii Department of Taxation, where he manages the Tax Research and Planning Office. This office is responsible for producing analytical reports related to the state's revenue system, revenue forecasting, estimating revenue impacts of proposed legislation, providing empirically based public policy analysis, and producing research. Prior to joining the Department of Taxation, Seth's career focused on economic and social development of developing countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, where he worked for the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and Johns Hopkins University. Seth is fluent in Portuguese and Spanish and holds a Ph.D. in political economy from Johns Hopkins University. Seth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Assuming that you guys can all hear me and see my slides. If not, please send me a chat. It's an honor to be here and to share things with you. So what I'm going to focus on today are three different things. One is I'm going to focus on the fiscal impacts as they look directly at the state of Hawaii. And the reason for that is the Tax Research and Planning Offices, that's one of the main focuses of the office itself. So that relates to the expertise. The second thing I wanted to talk about, and we did a little division of labor between the different panelists, is I wanted to talk about the monetary response. And the monetary response coming from the Federal Reserve is massive. And for a lot of people on Main Street, it's a little bit nebulous. We don't feel it. We don't get stimulus checks from the Fed. They do everything indirectly. So I just wanted to give some airtime to that. And clear things up and how that's affecting the entire nation, the global economy, and Hawaii itself. And then finally, I just wanted to take another out. One of my little passions is to encourage people to think like economists. And so at the very end, I'm going to just say what my priors are and what my assumptions are about the current crisis, and not because I think it's right. However, well, I think it's right, but not because I think anybody needs to agree. What I do think is that by identifying your assumptions and playing things out, I think it's a lot easier for us to think about this crisis. So let me begin with, let me just begin with a quote. So this is a kind of a famous quote for anybody in forecasting. Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And I added COVID-19. I went down, it's usually sometimes it's by Yogi Berra, sometimes it's by Mark Twain. I went down a Google hole, I found it. It's by the quantum physicist Niels Bohr. And the whole point is, when we're talking about predictions, we're talking about what happened in the past, and the future is inevitably different from the past. And so that's one of the things that makes it difficult to do. However, what we're trying to do here on this panel is, use our collective knowledge about what has happened in the past and see what we can apply it to the future. I wanted to, when I start slides, one of the first things I do is I just talk about the relative composition of state revenue, right? And so this is a graph that shows where all Hawaii taxes come from. Now, on the blue line at the very bottom is the general excise tax. The red is the individual income tax. This little green line is corporate income tax, and this purple line is TAT, or the transient accommodation tax. So, and then we have a number of different taxes on top. This is just to go to show you what we're really reliant upon. So when we think about revenues, when you think about, okay, how much is the state of Hawaii going to have? You can basically just focus on GET, individual income tax, and TAT, and you will have a good idea of the state of revenue collections in the state of Hawaii. So this goes to show, and this complements Eugene's graphs a little bit. So this is a tax revenue. This is normalized, and this is, okay. So this is tax revenue and economic performance. So the black line is Hawaii GDP. This gray line is total tax revenues. This one is GET collections, and the red dotted line is individual income tax collections. Now, this is normalized. What we do by normalized, it means just that we're comparing everything to a base and look at how they're performing proportionally to one another. So what you can see is I tried to include the big financial crisis, because that's like the last insight we have into economic downturns. What you can see in all of this is that tax revenues go down first, individual income tax starts to respond, and then it has the longest lag, and it takes the longest to get back to where it was. And the reason for this is there's two ways that revenue collections or individual income tax collections are affected by the economy. One is through withholdings. So we all have money taken out of our paycheck and pay, and that responds to unemployment and different things relatively quickly. The other thing is through declared estimated taxes. So those are the estimated tax payments that people send in, either through businesses or because of stock earnings, whatever. What you'll see is it takes a lot longer for these things to peter out and then rebound. The GET tax responds quicker. However, what's really interesting in all of this, and this goes nicely to what Eugene showed in his slides, this is most likely due to the decrease in tourism, right? So it's really hard for us to really get back on track without the tourism. And then once we are on track, overall our tax system has been, this is an ideal tax system, right? Because you want your taxes to more or less go in with GDP growth. So as your expenses rise, as your growing economy rises, you want your tax revenues to mirror that. You don't want it to be too high, and you don't want it to be too low. So that's where we are with tax revenues and with as it relates to economic growth. This is where we are right now. So this is a month-to-month comparison of general fund collections. Now, about 85% of all of our taxes the state of Hawaii collects goes to the general fund, which is the fund that the legislature can use for just about any type of spending. And what you see here are three different lines. The top line, this thick line, is for fiscal year 2020. So you see it goes up and down, and it comes right here. And the last official number we have is for March, right? You can see how it compares to the other. Years. Essentially, revenue growth or decline is the difference between this area between the blue line and the 2020 fiscal revenue. And this right here represents the year-on-year, year-to-date growth. So the good news about where we are right now is, as far as March, we're heading into a relatively robust revenue growth. Now, what we would normally expect to see is a big increase right here. This is not going to happen this year for two reasons. One is we're in an economic recession, and probably the bigger reasons, at least for the months of March and May, is the IRS has delayed filing requirements from April 15th all the way to July 15th. Hawaii has conformed to that, and that's going to delay all of our payments until next year. So we're expecting something, the preliminary figures will come out on Monday to the public. And so you guys can do, but what I expect, what I know actually, is the revenues are going to come right around here, 500, around between 600 and 500 million. And that's due to two reasons. One is we're already seeing the effects of consumption decline through our GET tax and our TAT tax. However, the bigger one is we're just putting off payments, and that payment is coming through payments with returns, which is how when people, when you file your taxes, sometimes you owe taxes or sometimes you get a refund. So we usually expect money to come in there, and also declared estimated taxes. And so this is like the periodic tax payments that come in from corporates and individuals, and they're just coming in slower because people are conserving their money. So the way that the state of Hawaii forecasts the revenue is through a council called the Council on Revenues. My office supports that council, so I will not be engaging in any type of forecast or revenue forecast for this, because that is the purview of the Council on Revenues, and I will defer to them. They're meeting on March 28th. However, what I'm showing here is I'm showing their forecast. So right here is what's already happened in the world, and here is their forecast in the world. This is the dollar amounts of their forecasts, and these are like the growth rates. And most of the time they focus on growth rates. So in January, when nobody had even heard of the coronavirus, this is what they were predicting. And this is what the state of Hawaii had based their budget on, right? Continual smooth growth. On March 11th, they met, and the full enormity of the crisis had not occurred yet they knew that something was going to happen with tourism. So what you saw is they predicted 3.8% growth here and 0% growth in fiscal year 21. Down here, you can see the two different forecasts. You can see the difference. So you can already see that the council had already downgraded economic growth and revenue projections by $318 million, which is quite substantial, right? Now, they're going to meet on May 28th, and they're going to lower it even more. So I would expect, if they were at zero growth right here, that's where they would go. It's probable that they're going to go negative growth this year, and next year we don't know, but somewhere around here. So what you can see is if you can start to imagine that the curve goes here and all the way up, the space between these two lines are massive, and that is that's the revenue shortfall, and that's what the state is going to have to contend with going forward. So that's it with the Council of Revenues. I just wanted to help you guys think about how you can, how different tax types are going to come through and impact revenue. So what you can see is general excise tax, that's about 50%, almost half of our general fund spending, that's going to come in a month of delay. Most people 98% of our payments are monthly filers. The individual income tax is going to come in through withholding and also through declared estimated taxes. And that just takes a while because remember, people in April 15th are paying last year's taxes. However, withholding taxes this year's taxes. So it's a very difficult thing to forecast. And it's really important to think that our revenue shortfalls are going to be very larger than what we actually anticipated because of a lot of the income that we were expecting in fiscal year 2020 is getting pushed to July fiscal year 21. The other taxes are transient accommodation tax, which will have a month delay. That's about 4.8%, even though it's 7.2% of all collections, a lot of that is distributed to counties and special funds. So we have the 4.8%, and then we have corporate tax, fuel tax, other things like that. So this, I wanted to give you a snapshot of what our tax data is already showing. So on the right is we made this super comparable. So this is different categories of the general excise tax, and for the month of February 2020 compared to the month of March 2020. And so what you see is these are the real declines. You'll see a 9.9% decline from the previous year. Now these are not, we're comparing apples to apples here, right? So in this case, we're actually comparing the amount of taxes. We're only comparing taxpayers who have paid in both periods. And so what you can see is, in what you would expect, is the hardest hit sectors are retail, theater and amusement, and transient accommodation tax. The other thing to note here is our neighbor islands are going to get hit worse than Oahu because Oahu has the most diversified economy. And our neighbor islands are incredibly dependent on tourism, Hawaii to a larger extent on agriculture as well. Since February and March, February has less days than March, what I did is I prorated these. So this is your daily earnings. And what you see is this increases it. So we already have a 15.7% decline. Now, what you saw from what Lesley showed in the past was that, or in the first slides, was most of what was happening and the big impacts of the economic downturn happened in the second half of March, right? So everybody needs to make their own decisions, but it's totally feasible that this could double or more this percentage in the next month. So in the month of April, in the month of May, or in May collections, which represent April economic activity. The other thing I wanted to point out is what's happening with withholding. And yeah, what's happening with withholding. In the withholding, withholding, it's been holding up relatively well. And other states have been seeing this as well. So despite the high levels of unemployment, our withholding taxes are still holding pretty well. I want to highlight a couple other things because a lot of our discussions are going to focus on tourism, right? And what you're going to find is that we have about 30 to 35% of our state tax revenues come from tourism. Now, this is a higher rate than what is part of our relative to our GDP. And that is because our tax system taxes tourists more than it taxes resident visitors. So what you can see is 17.5% of this comes directly, and the rest indirectly. And one of the things I just want to highlight is most of the second half comes from individual income, right? Because tourists do not pay individual income directly, but they do pay, our tourism workers do pay individual income tax. So I'm running low on time here, so I'm gonna move forward a little quicker than normal. I wanted to talk about the Fed, right? Because the Fed has done massive things. And one of the things that the Fed is doing what you can see here is this is a graph of the federal balance sheet. And this is from 2008. This is what people have been calling quantitative easing. And then in the last 8 weeks, we've seen a $3 trillion increase. And this is because the Federal Reserve has said, we will be the lender of last resort, not only to banks, which had done before, but to everybody. And this is massive. I mean, the state has never done, or the Federal Reserve has never intervened in markets quite as much as they are doing right now. Not only are they lending to banks, they're lending mortgage products, investment grade corporate bonds, junk bonds, right? Think of that. They're lending to subpar credit companies and state municipal governments. So the Federal Reserve is a key part of this intervention. And the reason I mention this is it's done a lot to quiet markets. So this is basically the result of what the Fed has done. What you'll see here is these are financial conditions within the United States, and they were looking pretty good. Mid-March, they deteriorated. This is when the Fed intervened and things went back up, right? This is just another measure of market volatility. You see it went up. So that just goes to show you the Fed has intervened and basically stabilized our economy while we were trying to figure out how we're going to respond to this virus. Now, I'm going to finish up with just this slide because I think it's really important, and it helps me think about the crisis, and I want everybody else. I think it's always useful to think like an economist, right? And what I mean by that is state your assumptions, build a model. It does not need to be a quantitative model, but think about how your assumptions are going to interrelate with the rest of the world, test and repeat. And the reason I say that is because we're all going to be wrong in this crisis. Nobody knows what's happening, and we're learning on the go. And the best way to do that is to make an assumption, build a model, test and repeat it, and learn from your mistakes, right? So I just wanted to share mine that is working right now. First, fiscal and monetary inventions have stabilized the economy in the short run. That's the last graph I just showed you, right? So our economy is on life support right now because of but there's not going to be a financial crisis in the next month or so. The question is, how do we move from there to the new equilibrium while minimizing social disruptions? Second, this is not an economic crisis. This is first and foremost. We need to figure out how to solve the health crisis, because without a healthy economy where people feel like they can interact with one another, there's not going to be as much economic activity. Third, this is a public sector capacity is a major constraint here. What I mean by that is we are currently in quarantine. Quarantine is a blunt instrument because we don't have the public sector capacity to engage in contact tracing and monitor outbreaks and deal with them effectively. What you will think about is the company or the countries that are usually lauded for their response to the crisis, Taiwan, South Korea, Germany, even Sweden that took a different approach, all have good public sector capacity. So that's one thing I always think about when thinking about this crisis. How can we build Hawaii's public sector capacity? Second, to follow up here, duration of the shutdown matters. The longer businesses are out of business, the less likely they are to come back. So there is some urgency here. Sometimes some things are not coming back. So one of the hardest things that we're going to have to come to terms with is that some businesses that existed before the crisis are no longer going to be needed going forward. If everybody telecommutes now, the lunches and the restaurants that serve the downtown community, there's just going to be less need there. So how are we going to adapt to the new crisis without, while still minimizing social pain, because change is painful. This is going to last for a while. We don't know how long this is going to last, but this is going to last a long time. And then finally, and I want to tweet my fiscal horn here, is government spending is shifting intertemporal liabilities. What I mean by that is we're borrowing against our own futures. So yes, does government spending, is it worth the bang for the buck right now? Yes, because there's nobody else that are willing to spend, and nobody else, no other form, especially the national government, no other entity has the capacity of the national government to get involved. However, eventually we're going to have to pay that back, right? So how are we going to do that? And when I think about that, that helps me think about prioritizing the investments here. And so when we are spending lots of money, we want to do it wisely. Okay, I think I went over a little bit of time here, so I apologize about that, but I'm going to stop sharing and allow for the next presenter.
Thanks, Seth. That was a great look at tax revenues, fiscal impacts, and monetary response. I know that I have a couple of questions, particularly in regards to that withholding. I thought that was really interesting. And then also, some businesses will fold, but presumably others will spring up in response to these new opportunities for innovation. But we'll wait on those until the end. I do see a couple of questions starting to trickle in. Just a reminder, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please write them in the chat function to be addressed at the end in our Q&A segment. That chat function should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you know to whom your question is addressed, write their name out in the beginning, and that will help us to stay organized. just another reminder, the presentations will be made available to everybody who has registered, as well as a recording of the event. So please make sure that you have registered at heamay2020.eventbrite.com. It's likely that everyone who's gotten here has registered, but if somehow you got the link and you haven't registered and you'd like these follow-up materials, that's how you will get them. So next up,
Lesley, since you have a question about withholding and everybody there, I'm looking at the chat. Why don't I just answer that one?
Sure.
I mean, everybody's like, oh, there's mass unemployment, there should be less withholding, right? I just got off yesterday I had an interesting chat with all the other state revenue collecting agencies. And withholding has been robust across the whole entire country, regardless of the state's economic situation. And there's two things that could explain this. One is we just haven't gotten there yet. Two is, even if you look in the last recessions, withholding always holds up, right? So it's just a really robust thing. If you think about who tends to lose jobs and stuff, they tend to be lower income people. And a lot of the withholding is coming from like higher income people, because we do have progressive tax structures. And then the third thing is a lot of people are receiving unemployment, and some people are receiving unemployment benefits that are higher than their current wages, right? Because with the federal plus up, you can receive $1,282 a week, which is comes out to about a $58,000 a year salary. So when people receive the unemployment insurance, they have the election to withhold their unemployment insurance as well. So we're looking into that. I do not know the answer to any of those three things. However, that is a potential answer to that. So it's probably one of those three.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. And I guess more so than what I'd been thinking, given the progressive tax structure and getting to hold on to those folks with higher wage jobs, that seems sensible. Well, thank you for that, Seth. And we are going to turn it over to Erik Kloninger, who is a Hawaii-based tourism and hospitality consultant. Before starting Kloninger and Sims Consulting, Erik worked at other local hospitality consulting practices, including Hospitality Advisors, Pricewaterhouse, Erik worked at other local hospitality consulting practices, including Hospitality Advisors, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and PKF Hawaii. Over the past 25 years, Erik has performed market and financial analysis of a variety of lodging types, including hotels, resort condominiums, timeshare resorts, and vacation rentals. His consulting experience also includes other tourism-related businesses, including visitor attractions, transportation, and master planned resort communities. Kloninger and Sims currently conducts several lodging supply studies for the Hawaii Tourism Authority, including the annual inventory of Hawaii visitor accommodations, a quarterly survey of Hawaii timeshare industry, and in partnership with Transparent Intelligence, a monthly tracking study of Hawaii's vacation rental market. A lifelong Hawaii resident, Erik enjoys experiencing Hawaii's natural environment, coaching high school soccer, and operating a vacation rental in Waikiki. Erik?
Thanks, Lesley. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on Hawaii tourism and thoughts on reopening and recovery of Hawaii tourism in light of the fact that we went basically from a situation of what a lot of people considered over-tourism to no tourism all at once. So coming up to the crisis, we had experienced a decade of tourism growth. This chart here shows monthly visitor arrivals 2010 through February 2020. It's in thousands. This is using the UHERO seasonally adjusted data. And you can see it's just steady rise. Visitor arrivals increased 62% over the period, from 542,000 to 879,000. Through February 2020, tourism was firing on all cylinders. Visitor spending was up 4.8% year over year. The hotel industry was doing especially well, with hotel RevPAR, which is revenue per available room, up 10% over the previous year. The biggest problem we had back then was too many tourists. So there was lots of press about over-tourism. And then the wheels fell off. So this is that same chart, the monthly arrivals 2010 to February 2020 in blue. I added in red the unadjusted visitor arrival numbers for March and April. Some additional data from the Hawaii Tourism Authority. This is the oh boy, sorry about that. This is the daily visitor arrivals. You can see the dark line here is this year, and it just falls off a cliff in the middle of March, and has stayed down here for the last 6 weeks. Again, some data from the Hawaii Tourism Authority, the weekly hotel statistics, where our hotel occupancies were up in the high 80s and fell in March and have been in the single digits. For the week ended April 25th, the state of Hawaii's hotel occupancy was 10.3% at an average daily rate of $128 with RevPAR of $13.25. For comparison, the statewide RevPAR through February was $263.73. So we have seen a 95% decrease in hotel revenues and therefore transient accommodations taxes. This is another photo of what it looks like for tourism here to go from running full speed to nothing. This is the excess rental cars that aren't being rented, that the rental car companies have no place to put them, so they have jammed them into the parking lot at Aloha Stadium. This is some data that the Hawaii Tourism Authority just released. We've been getting the daily visitor arrival numbers for the last few weeks, and just yesterday they gave a breakdown of the 4,500 Hawaii visitor arrivals between March 26th and April 30th. Now bear in mind, those are just the visitor arrivals. In addition to that, there are about 5,600 flight crew and 8,200 returning residents aboard the flights. But of the visitors, only 11% came here for vacation. Some of the rogue vacationers have gotten a lot of attention and been in the media, but really the majority of the visitors that we've seen since the 14-day quarantine have been people coming here to visit friends or relatives, or on business, or and then government as well. We also wanted to give a shout out to HTA, who during this crisis has pivoted very quickly to start giving daily visitor statistics, which has been very helpful. So give some credit to the HTA research team and their contractor SMS for the very good data. I want to quickly look at what visitor arrivals looked like during our 3 most recent visitor slumps. So the Gulf War, 1990, 1991. We saw monthly visitor arrivals decrease, peak to trough. The biggest decrease was 26%, and it took us 11 months to get back to the pre-event level. The 9/11 terror attacks, which was a much more precipitous drop right after the attacks, we saw a 27% decrease in arrivals, and it took 29 months to return to the pre-event level. Lastly, the 2008 financial crisis, which was a bit of a slowly unfolding crisis as different Wall Street firms were declaring bankruptcy. And overall, it ended up with a peak to trough 19% decrease in monthly arrivals. And it took us 41 months to return to visitor arrivals to return to the pre-event level, in part due to the very sluggish recovery of the US economy. So moving forward now to, okay, so that's what happened. That's what some other downturns have looked like. What is it going to look like this time? Because no one's ever seen anything like a 99% decrease in visitor arrivals, and the state effectively shut down to tourism. So the two things we need for Hawaii tourism to reopen safely. We haven't seen the plan for that yet, but we imagine it's going to include things like capacity limits, enhanced cleaning protocols, screening, testing, contact tracing. And then when is it going to happen is uncertain. Right now, many of the big hotels are open, taking reservations starting June 1, excuse me, following the expiration of the current 14-day quarantine. But that might be, those could be canceled if the quarantine period is lengthened. Second thing we need is large numbers of people willing and able to vacation in Hawaii. And there's some question about that, given it's an ongoing pandemic and the great economic uncertainty. I saw some research that said that about 3% of the Americans surveyed said that they were expecting to take their next trip in June. 4.7% said they'd be ready by July, increasing to 6.9% in August. So it looks like it's going to continue to be a very slow summer, even if we do open up. By September, the survey showed that 10% of Americans would be ready, or they planned on, or they expected to take their next trip. I also note that 34.1% of the sample said that they were not going to travel until next year. So as we open up, we face a number of headwinds, both in the near term and longer term. So first and foremost is the lack of clarity on when the 14-day quarantine will be lifted. Visitors understandably will be hesitant to book travel to Hawaii with the 14-day quarantine in effect. Once we do open up, there will be airlift capacity constraints. So empty seat next to you, that sort of thing, where at best we're going to be seeing planes flying here half full, whereas traditionally the airlift to Hawaii operated at very high load factors, high 80s, low 90s. There's also some research that consumers want to avoid urban destinations, possibly due to how hard hit New York City has been, which could be problematic for our urban beach destination, Waikiki. And then there's also the global recession. And then of course, underlying all of this is the continued concern about the ongoing pandemic. Longer term, the potential for a U-shaped or very sluggish economic recovery could slow down Hawaii tourism recovery. The financial strength of the airlines have all been hammered financially by this, and we're completely dependent on them for tourism. So we need the airlines to stay flying and to increase flights as it'll be in a position to increase flights as demand dictates. Another thing we face is anti-tourism sentiment. The survey I cited from destination analysts found that 60% of Americans don't want travelers in their community right now. Now we can layer this on top of the growing concerns about over-tourism that we had in the state. And then on top of that, the fact that we do have one of the lowest infection rates in the whole country. There's a strong desire to keep it that way, and visitors are perceived as that's the way we would get sick, is travelers coming. A couple other factors would be potential decrease in lodging supply if the counties continue to step up their enforcement on vacation rentals, which started before this crisis. I note that last year, 10% of Hawaii's visitors stayed in a rental house. So that's going to be an important component of our tourism recovery. Lastly, I think there are going to be delays or overall scrapping of some of the planned new hotel, timeshare, and condo hotel projects that have been in the works. Tailwinds on the plus side. As I mentioned, we do have a very low rate of infection among states, almost the lowest. Consumer research shows beach destinations appear to be high on the list of desired vacations. And 70% of Americans say they miss travel and want to travel again. Now, this is from the same survey that said 60% of Americans don't want travelers coming to where they live. So Americans want to travel. They're not quite ready to do it yet, and they definitely don't want people traveling to where they live. In addition to that, underlying demand for Hawaii vacations was strong going into this. And so we would expect, and even given the great restrictions, there's still a couple of hundred visitors a day coming. Lastly, because we have controlled points of entry, we have the opportunity to brand Hawaii as a safe vacation destination. So there is some positive potential there, depending on how we execute on that. Lots of uncertainty, of course. Will we reopen mass tourism safely? And if so, when? So we're all waiting to find out when that's going to happen. It's critically important that we get it right, that we don't open up and have an outbreak here locally, both from a public health standpoint and also from an economic standpoint. We need to get it right. The timeline for antiviral drugs and a vaccine is going to impact how Hawaii bounces back. The quicker that stuff is developed, the better for everyone. If those efforts are delayed, then the timetable for everything gets moved back. Presidential election coming up in 6 months. There's going to be some political uncertainty, and then the last one is, are we going to see there's lingering anti-tourism sentiment, or will there be a realization that tourism is the only game in town economically? So on that, I wanted to kind of quickly touch on some recent research that came out on the benefits and problems created by tourism. This was done by OmniTrack for the Hawaii Tourism Authority, and it was released earlier this year. And so in 2019, 58% of Hawaii residents said they believe that Hawaii tourism has brought more benefits than problems. Contrast that with 10 years ago, when 80% of residents agreed that tourism has brought more benefits than problems. So there has been, over this period, there has been a decrease in that belief, at the same time that visitor arrivals were increasing steadily. So people interpret this as meaning this is an indication of dissatisfaction driven by over-tourism. Drilling down on the problems created by tourism that were cited by the people who believe that tourism has brought more problems than benefits to Hawaii. Other than the cost of living, all of the big ones center on the idea that there's just too many of them here. And it's a little bit out of control, not respecting the culture, the aina, impact on the environment, traffic. But almost half of people felt that the state is too dependent on tourism. And another 35% felt that locals don't benefit from tourism. I also note that 25% of the respondents cited health or the potential for epidemics as a problem created by tourism. So it's going to be interesting to see going forward where that number goes, because that shows that there was already a fair level of awareness of potential of this happening. And lastly, I note that vacation rentals were cited as a problem created by tourism by 1% of survey respondents. So that indicates that the opposition to vacation rentals, while very vocal and getting a lot of coverage, is not something that is a particularly widespread belief. This slide here on, this was what Seth would consider the good old days last year, when there was $600 million in TAT, transient accommodations taxes. In addition to that, there was another about $200 million of general excise tax associated with lodging. And this pie chart here shows where that money went. I think that going forward, one of the things that we as an industry and a community need to do is, given what the local residents are feeling in terms of the impacts of tourism, the problems created by tourism, and the benefits provided by tourism, I think we need to revisit how this pie is sliced up in the future. people ask, when are we going to see 10 million visitor arrivals again? I no idea. Maybe never, if that's what we want, and that might be what we want. Maybe never, despite our best efforts. It could be that 10 million was it, and we'll never see it again. Or maybe 3 to 4 years if all the stars align. And then a final thought, and this has to do with, but I'm the only person on this panel who doesn't have a PhD in economics, so maybe I see things a little differently. But one of the numbers that has gotten a lot of attention is the number of 17.5% or 23%, which is the impact of tourism on GDP. And there are a lot of people I know that seems low to some of us, because other than tourism and federal spending, we don't produce a lot, we don't export a lot. The vast majority of the economy is us buying and selling things to each other locally. And I just want to remind everyone, this is one of the new Matson ships that they're monsters. They're almost 900 feet long, and they arrive just about every day. So we import just about everything that we consume here, including 85 to 90% of our food. And it begs the question of how on earth are we going to pay for all of this stuff? And the answer, of course, traditionally has been millions of people come here, and last year they spent $18 billion. Now this year it's not going to be $18 billion. So clearly we've got some, it's going to have a very strong, a very powerful impact on our economy. And but tourism has been what's paying the bills, so we will see how it recovers. Thanks.
Thank you, Erik. And I do see a few questions rolling in. We'll try to keep these questions to the Q&A at the end, so feel free to write your questions now, but just so everyone can focus on the presentations, we will make sure to provide those responses here at the end. And we're running a little over, so we're trying to get you out of here at 1. We may go a little longer, but of course, no obligation to stay on if you're not able. Next up, last but not least, is Paul Brewbaker, Principal of TZ Economics. Paul has been involved in Hawaii economic research as a commercial bank economist for 25 years and as a consulting economist for 10 years. He holds a Ph.D. in economics from UH and a certified business economist designation from the National Association of Business Economics. Paul?
Thanks, Lesley, and thanks everybody for your patience getting here. Yes, I live between a fire station and a hospital, so that's what's going on outside. My colleagues have emphasized in several aspects the role of tourism and as a channel of transmission for this biological event, compounding the problem of domestic community spread. And my original assignment was to pick up there and shift the focus a little to investment. I have some COVID-19 slides that I was asked to slip in, so I'll do that as well. But I will get to my original assignment by the end. So here we go, ready? So a new dawn on the 2020s. And as I say, some of my colleagues were hoping I would show these slides, which I'd cut out. So this is what I'm getting in terms of Hawaii's case count. They just fit a little model, an epidemiological model to the data, and it looks like we're in pretty good shape in Hawaii. Other states, including some of those who are starting to open, and these are normalized data, have already begun experiencing their second waves. And of course, the challenge with safely opening tourism is that we don't want to reintroduce one here. 100 years ago, during the influenza pandemic, second waves were a problem, and this stuff has all been studied, so it's not like a mystery. If you prematurely withdraw social distancing measures, you will have a second wave, and these are death counts. So, you know, be careful what you wish for. Some cities which were successful initially at taking down mortality, found themselves in a position within a few months of having a second wave of mortality in this case. And by the way, the links to all my slides, all the data in my slides are usually in the footnotes at the bottom of the slide. When you get the PDF from the Hawaii Economic Association website, you can explore some of these things on your own. As has been mentioned earlier today, there are many countries who have adopted much stricter social distancing measures and more aggressive testing and contact tracing and tracking. Some, like Singapore, who had early success, more recently have had renewed and persistent problems. So that's also a lesson for us. Currently, there are more coronavirus cases on Oahu with 1 million people than there are in Taiwan with 24 million. So you can do it. Just call your classmate from calculus back in the day, because, right, nobody's making movies called Crazy Rich Local Buggers. Sweden has a relatively laissez-faire approach, relying on social cohesion to effect social distancing. Unfortunately, those have costs, and you can see that Sweden also has 1,000 times the mortality rate as Taiwan. So again, I want to emphasize this because some of my colleagues have during the course of the morning, that you know, how we get out of this matters, and that's a debate we're all engaged in right now. Erik showed you some of these slides: the daily passenger counts dropping to zero, the monthly visitor counts dropping to zero. I do want to make the point that just because it hasn't happened in a while doesn't mean it hasn't happened before. These are Hawaii visitor counts from the 1920s and 30s. And then, like now, we had business cycles, the roaring 20s, the Great Depression after the stock market crash of 1929, which was sort of the canary in that coal mine. And in the late 1930s, a series of West Coast dock worker strikes that took tourism to zero for about 6 months. Just to make the point that these outsized or fat-tailed or leptokurtotic event risks are rare. I mean, that's their definition, and obviously intense. But we do have a history of getting over them, and I'm reminded of one of my favorite books. I'm not looking at my screen, but This Time is Different, a book on financial crisis, reminds us that we still can learn from some of these experiences. Let me suggest an example of that. Kauai went through a total shutdown of tourism after Hurricane Iniki. 25 years later, the visitor count was no different from what it had been prior to Hurricane Iniki, although it did actually reach all-time highs over the last couple of years. And that event was important because of what it tells us about the nature of the recovery process. I want to focus on one aspect of that in particular. When you have these outsized risk events manifest themselves and seemingly shake up people's perceptions of the risks that surround them, one of the activities investors engage in very quickly is trying to mitigate future risk exposure. In the case of Iniki, you had a hurricane that was a once-in-a-century hurricane that followed the previous once-in-a-century hurricane by 10 years. So at that point, investors in the lodging industry on Kauai, which had already securitized some of that risk exposure before Iniki, half the lodging units on Kauai were hotel rooms, and the other half were mostly condos, which is a securitized lodging unit, as well as a smattering of vacation rentals. After Iniki, condos and hotel rooms were further securitized into timeshare units. So you strip the condo into intervals and you sell the intervals. And of course, vacation rentals have grown to take up, combined with timeshare now, half of the inventory, the two together, 30% timeshare, 20% vacation rental. So expect similar kinds of structural change, capital reallocation, if you will, but expect a tremendous change in the way people deploy industrial space, and even residential capacity, points to which Erik alluded I may come back to. Just a note on vacation rentals, remember that hosting apps reduced the search and matching costs that made it difficult to identify and locate alternatives to conventional hotel and resort lodging. And of course, hosting apps also reduced the barrier to entry on the supply side. So when you have both demand and supply increasing, quantity is going to increase inevitably, even if the price effects are ambiguous. And again, we have these technologies that allow us, for example, to do restaurants completely differently from the way we were doing before. And now that we have a good reason to do restaurants differently, it makes you wonder why we were doing it the way we were doing it before to begin with. Part of the character of this unfolding recession is that, unlike a normal sort of, usual recession, which they tend to be consumption-led, investment-led, this one is definitely consumption-led. And you can see that actually if you, of course, if you look at the US data, which is what we're looking at here, but if you think about some of the math that my colleagues were talking about earlier, if you say that tourism declined by minus 100% and its share of the economy is, let's call it, 17 to 23%, depending on, how much of the footprint you want. Let's call it 1/5. So that's, 0.2 times 1 is still 0.2. So you would say that GDP growth just from the tourism part would have declined at, say, a 20% annualized rate in this quarter. And then, of course, domestic consumption, resident consumption has gone down, although as several other speakers have mentioned, the integrity of the social safety net helps preserve some of that consumption, even if there's employment loss. At the same time, you have people autonomously reducing their consumption because of risk aversion. These are the kinds of forecasts for GDP we're seeing nationwide. I would say we can throw out the guys who thought it was going to be 0, but in this case of a survey last month, minus 25 to 50% is probably the right range. The CBO forecasts a 40% annualized rate of minus 40% annualized rate of GDP growth in the second quarter of this year for the US. So I would say Hawaii sort of starts there and moves to 50%. This is how the US GDP growth rate fits against the record of the last decade. And again, you might say, well, that's never happened before, but in Hawaii, it actually has in the post-war period, wherein GDP in, I think, 1947, or it might have been 1946, decreased at a 35%. Well, these are annual GDP. So the question for us now is, notwithstanding how large the decrease is going to be at the end of this time series, when we put the 2020 data in here, it shouldn't unduly frame the way we think about the future from this point forward. And the more aggressively we approach, for example, the recovery of tourism as an export activity through screening, testing, tracing, isolation, and tracking, or some blend of those, like a Bordeaux wine, will depend on how fast and how safely we achieve that. In the immediate post-war period, it's important to remember that the 30 years that followed, if you look at the 1950 through 1980 arc of real GDP growth, which had a political analog, the so-called catch-a-wave moment in island politics, documented by McKenna Kaufman's dad, Tom Kaufman, in a famous book about the period. This was sort of the great wave where we went from the tallest building in Hawaii being Aloha Tower to the way things basically look today. And then we became hippies and we stopped doing that. So let me just frame what that longer term investment cycle really looks like so that we can think about the 2020s, and then I'll be done. Right now, we've had a great surge in government construction in the 2010s that may be coming to an end. And at any rate, right now, maybe building bridges isn't as important as ensuring that we have public health outlays at the level that's appropriate. If you deconstruct total private construction, so we did public, if you deconstruct total private construction commitments, as UHERO calls it, private building permit values, over the last century, this is what it looks like. You can break out the data into 3 components: a cyclical component, a noise component, and a trend component. And there in that trend component, you can see that period of growth in the first half of the 20th century, and then the period in the second half where we sort of, became hippies and decided we'll just keep investment at a relatively stable level. These are additions to productive capacity every year, no doubt. If we look more closely at that cyclical component, you can really see how this longer cycle, I don't know what frequency cycle this is. It's not really the business cycle, because you can see the US recessions shaded in the backdrop of this slide. But nevertheless, the business cycle matters. And often these two go together, as after the subprime bubble, which of course, because it was bubblicious, helped determine how large the downturn was going to be. We've just gone through another wave in the 2010s, and I thought we were positioning for a wave in the 2020s. And the question we were talking about before all of this happened was, what would that look like? What would we be building? How much would it be resilience investment to mitigate the impacts of future climate change outcomes? The same data at monthly frequencies, that is the high frequency data, thankfully, boy, wouldn't it be bad if this wasn't true, thankfully display or exhibit the same long cycle. So again, this question that we were facing as recently as January, February, when we had not a care in the world, continues to pose a challenge for us, in the sense that we have to integrate it with how we mobilize the more near-term recovery. And these are just the bullet points I think of. If you think in the space-time sort of continuum, a lot of retail space has been rendered superfluous. I'm thinking some of it was to begin with. So I'm imagining Macy's as a residential condominium at Ala Moana Center. Food service, really, did we, half the supply chain was going to restaurants, only half to households or supermarkets from which they acquired their food. Is food service going to come back the way it did? Certainly not without tourism, and for many people, not if every other table is no longer usable. Office space, everybody enjoying working at home? I mean, that happened. And of course, the lesson from toilet paper is maybe we do need another warehouse. Erik has alluded to some of the lodging industry impacts, and it's not uncommon for us to go through one of these shocks and for the new owners to show up bottom fishing in the next 12 months, because the return on their investment will be calculated after the current event, just as the return on the investors who got caught in this downdraft are going to walk away from their investments. And then residential investment, we just got 30,000 additional rooms on the island. What are we going to do with those? Not to mention vacation rental. In the time dimension, I just come back to this final point about the 2020s, that it's not just physical capital formation. I have data on construction, so that's what I use. But I want to emphasize equipment investment is important. And finally, because I've gone way over my time now and I'm at the 15-minute mark, human capital investment should not be forgotten. If the millennials today had, as a generalization, better early childhood cognitive and non-cognitive skills development in the 1990s, not as many of them would be caught up in the downdraft, because their skills would have allowed them to be engaging in activities that didn't have to be affected by the shutdown of non-essential businesses. So that's, I saw UH officials talking about next fall. I'm thinking, dude, with 200,000 people unemployed, this is the summer to have higher education be free in Hawaii online. Let's go. But I realize bureaucracies don't move that fast, and I'll stop there. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Paul.
Let me stop sharing.
All right, I'm going to take over, share screen here. So we are going to move into the Q&A portion. We have a little bit less time than we had anticipated. So I'm going to get started here with a couple of questions. And panelists, I know that you had some questions for each other, so feel free to get the ball rolling on that too. This first question is for Eugene or Seth, whoever might be able to answer. Although some things are not coming back, new industries may emerge or expand. For example, the gig food delivery services in Hawaii have taken off. Can you speak to that a bit more and how it interacts with the state recovery team's industrial planning in terms of some businesses are going to fail during this, some businesses are going to close, but we will have an increase in other businesses?
Yeah, I would like to start with that because if you look at the historical, this time is is a little different because I think the government is right to the point to save the small business. You can see in April, actually the bankruptcy filing in April, well, a lot of people lost jobs, but the bankruptcy filing was decreased by around 28%. So I think the businesses, the federal government or state government is, they are trying to save the businesses, the small, especially for small businesses. So I think after this crisis, I think there will be some changes in our business structure, or the way to do business, or people, the way of spending. You know, the one I showed that this is the first time, usually the consumer spending is about 71 to 74% of the GDP. I think this year, 2020, will be very huge. And if you calculate according to that formula I provided, is about 81%. And we never had that kind of consumer spending. It's the economy for this year is mainly based on the consumer spending. I think it will be some change in both business consumer into the future.
Okay.
Can I respond to that as well?
Yeah.
So I haven't worked in this economy as long as my colleagues have. However, I will say this, in my review of everything, there's been a constant attempt to diversify Hawaii's economy even more. And it has had questionable results, right? And so there has been a lot of money coming in. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with it. It'll be interesting to see what happens with tourism, right? Because it is very difficult to start businesses in a economy where everything is very expensive, right? And so there is, in some sort, is the market, the prices reflect that we're in a tourism economy, and it's hard to establish a business or pay people without those prices rebalancing. And so it'll be interesting to see if tourism really becomes less prominent, what that does to the rest of the businesses in terms of like land costs and different things. And that could shape the economy. However, changing the actual industrial makeup of the economy takes years and sometimes decades. And so I wouldn't expect anything to be very different in 2 or 3 years' time.
Seth, any thoughts on what industries might emerge as a maybe not a replacement, but as a forerunner to compete at least with tourism?
I mean, I wish I did, or else I'd go be an investor. People are always focusing on, like what Paul said, focusing on human capital. You have to remember, like, if you actually look at we all focus on the gig economy. The gig economy is very hard, right? The gig economy is usually consolidated in 4 or 5 metropolitan areas within the United States. And they have extremely high levels of human capital, higher than what we have in Hawaii. So that's tough. One of the things I'm spitballing here, but one of the things I've always thought that we could do is you could make it more attractive for digital nomads to live here. So people who can work from anywhere in the world, they choose to live here because of the high quality of life. And then, if they spend 2 or 3 years here, they start talking to everybody. And that's one way to attract human capital to create some kind of little entrepreneur of kind of like the gig economy here.
Hey, you guys, sorry, I got to jump in here. Okay, this is not the time to say, ooh, cool, we're not doing tourism. Let's do something else. Okay, there's no way anything happens economic recovery-wise without figuring out how to get tourism online. And nothing that we're talking about couldn't already be done before and now. So it's not a question of whether we should do tourism or something else. It's how do we do all of the above? In the case of tourism, it involves safety protocols that we've never had to think about before. That's what makes it challenging. But there's nothing that prevents what Seth and I are talking about. Look at us, we're at home, we're living the gig economy. I'm just saying, this is not an excuse to not do tourism. This is a reason to do tourism the right way and to do everything else that we aspire to do.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for bringing us back to reality, Paul. That was a good point.
All right. Another question for Eugene or anybody who wants to jump in on this one. Eugene, you had mentioned anticipated recovery times for this recession being similar to the previous at, I believe you said 6 years for tourism, 2 years for non-tourism. What impact is the larger amount coming from the federal government this time versus previously, 7 billion versus 1.5 billion? What impact does that have? And can we hope for a speedier recovery because of that difference?
I think because this time the impact is from two areas. One is the virus. Even the virus crisis is finished in a year, or maybe when the vaccine developed. But then the next one is coming from the economic recession. So the U.S. economy will have a recession, or 67% of the visitors are coming from the U.S. mainland. So the 2009 model or growth path or recovery path is mainly based on the economic recession. So even the virus situation is resolved in about a year or so, the economic recovery will be a long time. And this time, you see that the main increase, it will be the consumer spending is because of the federal money will be reflected in the spending because the most of the money is coming as the small business loan and also the paycheck and also the unemployment insurance. So currently, you see many of the workers, I think they are getting more than the regular pay. I think our median hourly wage is about $21, between 21 to 22. But if you include the state and the federal, the total weekly payment is around 1,100. So it is equivalent to about $27 per hour. So that will increase, because of this will increase some the household spending. But that is not going to last long. It's maybe only about toward the end of this year. When the federal system will be all finished. And 2021 is the one we need to worry about. I think the worry about 2021 is mainly coming from the economic recession.
And
let me just add on to that. Because of that outlook, has certain assumptions associated with it. Let's take that Tian's outlook and then add Seth's aspiration. So what if instead of requiring that people come to Hawaii to buy stuff, we made content that people were willing to buy from us without coming to Hawaii? That's the kind of radical change in the way we think about tourism or exporting that does present itself as an opportunity, and for which these, technology options to which Seth alluded are probably the pathway as opposed to airplanes.
From Amazon.
Well, why don't you? That's
what Jimmy and Robert.
okay. And it just in general terms, Eugene, particularly for that question that was just to you, but for everybody, do these forecasts and these anticipations assume a single wave of the virus, or are you taking into account that there could be additional waves of the virus to further interrupt the economy?
Yeah, my projection will be just a single wave, because the second, the future waves, we don't know yet. Just assuming, that's why I'm saying if I do the projection today, because the first wave is diminishing, but it's not finished yet. So I'm not considering the second wave yet. But if we open too soon, that's why I'm saying if the visitor industry is open, maybe the second half year only about 40%. So it's not, if we open too soon, then maybe a second wave.
Would anyone else like to comment on that as far as your own models go?
I would say this, that like models do not predict the future. The only thing that is the future is the future. The models is just a way of talking about the future. So the fact that most of us only include a single wave and it's petrifying our future forecasts should just show that like, oh, it could get worse and we could add a couple more dimensions into it. However, like I would really caution against specifying like this is going to happen here. What we really need is a really dynamic approach. And most likely there will be second waves, but they won't be a national wave. They'll be like regional, right? And there could be one in Hawaii or there could be one somewhere else in the world. And how's that going to affect us, right? So I would be cautious to say, oh, can you come up with a number for this? I mean, we can come up with numbers for this, but what does that mean, right? So there's actually more benefit in coming up with 4 or 5 different scenarios and just using those as talking points rather than just saying, can you change your scenario?
And let me just say, I know we're going a little bit over. I think we'll take a few more questions, but anyone who can't stay on, that's fine. If you could give us some feedback, hopefully you can see my screen, the feedback form, tinyurl.com/HEA feedback form, and this will also be emailed to you. But we'll take a few more questions before we get off. Appreciate anyone who can stay on. If not, that's no problem. We will have kind of a follow-on event next month, June 4th, featuring Alan Oshima. So if you can join us for that, save the date. We'll get some information out for that here in the next week or so. Paul, did you have something you wanted to add?
I'm trying not to say, as long as Alan doesn't talk about, what was it? We need to re-examine our core values. No, brother, we don't need to do that. We just need to get going. Yeah, I do want to pick up on something Seth was talking about. Could I show one more slide? It's good to go.
Sure.
This idea of second waves and whatnot, I think is a really important one to remember, because you know, it's happened before and you sort of have to know it's a possibility. I mentioned earlier this experience where cities a century ago in the influenza pandemic, some of them prematurely withdrawing their social distancing measures, and those are the gray blobs there, ended up with these second death waves. So I think to Seth's point, it's really important to sort of, you know, you may have a model which doesn't have one of these secondary events, but it's probably prudent to be thinking in terms of models that do have them. And Seth made this important observation that it's dynamic, right? So you have the initial drop, and then you have an oscillatory convergence back to whatever the new equilibrium is, because you're going to go 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And you can make those models, and then you can, you know, ask yourself, how much does this cost if we have a volatile as opposed to a smooth path? And the answer is always that smoother is better if you can pull it off. Then the question is, are the net benefits of taking the actions necessary to smooth out the path, like prevent a second wave, worth, you know, the costs? Because it's not cheap to diagnostically test everybody every day or whatever. And those are real world challenges that governments operating under fiscal constraints right now are going to have to, you know, answer for themselves one way or another, by default or by design. it's going to be hard work, and better somebody else do it than me.
Can I ask a question of the other panelists?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
one of the things that I've been thinking about is traditionally it's our international tourists that are higher spenders. However, our borders are currently closed right now. And if you look at around the world, most people are trying to keep their borders closed at least until the end of the year. So I was wondering, especially since we have a bunch of people who thought about tourism a lot, how does that, and everybody always says, oh, we need to increase visitor spending, which to me has been hard, right? Because if hotels and everybody could charge more, they probably would, right? So, or maybe I'm wrong. But how do you attract, who are we going to attract and how in the medium term, and given the constraints of closed borders and difficulty of bringing people in and things like that?
It's a huge problem with international travel closed down. Huge problem for Hawaii, particularly because of the high spending nature of the Japanese visitors. So I haven't seen anything on what the timeline is for that market to come back. So it's an excellent point, Seth.
Let me jump in with a more dour view. Sorry, I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but the impulse to cut off the rest of the world for the time being was one that was embraced after the pandemic and in the aftermath of World War I because of some of the untoward outcomes like hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic and protectionism and isolationism more broadly in the United States during the 1930s. And down that path lies an even greater risk of geopolitical upheaval. So we were already, prior to this, for the last 2 years, moving down the path of protectionism and moving away from multilateralism. And it impaired our ability and continues to inhibit our ability both to contain the viral contagion, to the mitigation that we're all engaged in right now, and will delay the development of treatments and vaccination to the extent that we don't try to get back to a more collaborative, global environment. So I'm concerned, and Seth raises an important point, that not being able to get international tourists back to Hawaii is just one dimension of a broader set of challenges in the creep towards isolationism, protectionism, and away from multilateralism that we've seen in recent years.
Can I also make one, I don't know where we are, but I also, in an attempt to make a positive note out of all of this, we are a really rich country and we are a rich state compared to other countries in the world. And we should feel very fortunate that we have the ability to put our economy on life support for 2 or 3 months, basically keep people from going into poverty and thinking and that will give us time to move forward. And that's just a hugely privileged position that most developing countries in the world do not find themselves in, right? You can't ask people not to work for 3 months and without huge social consequences. And we are part of the United States, which has the fiat default currency of the world. We can take on huge amounts of debt to pay off for things. So we're, I'm not saying that, or we do have challenges in front of us, Hawaii in particular, and we need to make wise decisions. On the other hand, we are really lucky. You couldn't do this in the 1918 because the United States wouldn't be rich enough to have done the same level of response.
Thanks for that, Seth. Eugene, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I want to add the tourism, because when we look at the daily spending, the Canadians are the lowest, US West are lower. But at this time, if you look at the per person per trip spending, actually the number one is US East, because they stay longer time. They stay about 15 days. And surprisingly, Canadians, they also spent more than Japanese, because if you look at it per person per trip, Japanese spending is about 1,400. But if you look at the other US East market and the Canadian market, they spent more than 2,000 per trip. So I think at this time, because the developing, I think the question Seth was asking, without or very little international, what do we do? I think we should attract more US East visitors. I think Hawaii, when we competing with others, I think the one thing come into play is the comparative advantage. We can develop other things, other industries, but we still, our advantage is on tourism. So I think for a development, I think tourism is still the most important for, at least for the short term, for the recovery. That should be the concentration.
Erik made this really important point that there's an opportunity right now for Hawaii to be a first mover and have first mover advantage in cultivating a new reputation as a safe destination for the domestic visitors, and then presumably that can translate into the international travel market as countries begin to open up.
And in regards to tourism, there were a few questions that came in having to do with average daily spending in some way or another. So Erik, this question is for you, or anyone who wants to jump in, of course. Average daily spending has been declining. Is there any consideration in targeting visitors that spend more as we plan for this recovery?
Well, that's always the goal, is to attract the higher spending visitors. I believe that that's been a policy objective of the Hawaii Tourism Authority for some time. We touched on the challenge that we're going to face, given the fact that Japanese visitors do spend more than US visitors on a per person per day basis. But I think, and visitor spending is terribly important, because at the end of the day, that's what matters, is the dollars. We want more dollars, and not necessarily just to focus on the number of bodies. So you know, not to diminish that, but in this next period, I think we're in recovery mode, where the focus is just going to be on figuring out how to do it effectively, how to open up safely, and how to start welcoming people back in a way that the resident population is comfortable with. But yeah, visitor spending is always the big objective. And I'll turn it over to Paul, because that's his baby. The real visitor spending has been down since what, 1980?
Well, it hasn't changed in 30 years. The total. Personally, I think it's kind of a Don Quixote exercise to think that we can engineer an increase in spending. But I'm not saying it's something that we shouldn't continue to attempt to do. The fact that it's been going down for a half century suggests to me that we should be doing other things as well. And this discussion earlier about using the fact that, as Eugene says, the fact that we already have the comparative advantage, we just wake up and we can do tourism every morning. That advantage allows us to attempt to do other things, most of which are going to fail. Now, as some people have observed in the Zoom chat bar here, if you can't build telescopes next to telescopes, doing the other things is going to be challenging, and so and those continue to be challenges. But as Seth also pointed out earlier, the fact that those were always problems. Right now, we have to get through the V or the U or the hockey stick or the Nike swoosh. Right. This is the moment to pull out all the stops to take advantage of the sheer power of our strong, credit standing in municipal bond markets as a state, and the strength of advanced economies in general, like the United States, to make that intertemporal decision, borrow from future consumption, to ensure that we minimize the decrease in consumption, both resident consumption in our case, and those of tourists to whom we export consumables and goods and services, to ensure that that doesn't have to fall any further than it already has or needs to.
And just to couple on what everybody else is saying is, in terms of the fiscal impact, the best way we can get out is not raising taxes, it's not cutting spending, it's growing our economy, right? So the difference between 2% growth and 4% growth doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of that, that solves our unfunded liability crisis, or that's the difference between an unfunded liability crisis and getting out of it. So we all have to think about growth as a way forward and a way that's sustainable and acceptable to our populations and serves everybody. However, without, kind of like what everybody's saying, we can't close up shop without incurring even more social upheaval, I think.
This is why I went back to the early 20th century to look for guidance. You look over a 30-year period, bookended by world wars, global pandemic, and the Great Depression. And what people chose to do when they got out of that experience was punch tunnels through the Colorado Mountains. You know what I mean? Let's create the foundation for future economic activity. And we face a similar kind of challenge now, but what we've learned from the last century is that how you do it matters. So you shouldn't irresponsibly invest in human, or we should probably do more human capital formation, but we shouldn't irresponsibly invest in physical capital formation without taking into account environmental and natural resource consequences of those decisions and build them into the decision making to begin with. So for example, the same technology that we would use as a pricing tool, right? The same technology that we would use as a pricing tool for people using natural resource based recreational and leisure time, the endowment that we have in Hawaii, here in Hawaii, could also be purposed in the contact tracing and tracking and applications that we think may be required in order to safely rehabilitate tourism at some point in the future. I'm just saying there's more than one way of doing things responsibly, socially, environmentally, and culturally responsibly than prohibition. And we should really move forward on all of those fronts at the same time.
Thank you, Paul. And I think on that note, we are going to wind down here. We have a lot of questions that we didn't get to. We certainly weren't expecting this response. We had nearly 700 people register. So we will figure out how to address these last questions. And as I had mentioned previously, we'll provide the slides, the feedback form, and the recording of today's event to everybody who registered. I do want to thank our panel for providing such great information to such a broad audience, and to Carly Liddell, who's been enormous support behind the scenes, ensuring a smooth event. Thanks also to Paul Migliorato, who left no stone unturned in getting our promotional information out, and to our new intern, Sierra Brewer, who just came on board last week and has already been a tremendous asset. Thank you also to our members, our board, and our returning attendees, and those who are joining us for the first time. We hope that you'll consider regular attendance at our monthly events. As mentioned, next month, June 4th, we anticipate a webinar featuring Alan Oshima, who is appointed by Governor Ige to lead the statewide COVID-19 recovery initiative. We strive to make our events relevant and beneficial to Hawaii's diverse business community by tackling topics that are pertinent and breaking them down to be accessible to a broad audience. We hope that you found this to be the case and look forward to your feedback. Thank you again for your time and attention, and we'll keep you posted on our June event. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback. That information will be coming to you via email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lesley, for all your hard work putting this together.
Thank you.
Into that.
Good job.
Thanks, guys. This was a great event. We appreciate it. Have a good rest of your week.
Bye.
Bye.